وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على ختم الأنبياء وإمام المرسلين سيدنا ونبينا محمد ذي القدر العظيم وعلى آله وأصحابه وأتباعه إلى يوم الدين. اللهم فقهنا في الدين وعلمنا التأويل وألهمنا رشدنا يا رب العالمين. Alhamdulillah. In our lessons on the commentary of Imam Sawi on Jawharat al-Tawheed, in these lessons in which we also look at إيضاح المبهم شرح السلم in mantiq, in logic, we have reached the investigation on al-qidam, right? And this is now beginning to look at al-sifat al-salbiya, the attributes of negation. This investigation is in many works frequently referred to as at-tanzihat, mabhath at-tanzihat, right? And tanzih is very important, and it's one of the distinguishing characteristics of Ahl Sunnah, right? More in specific, but also it's one of the distinguishing characteristics of our religion. فَعْلَمْ أَنَّهُ لَا إِلَهَ إِلَّا اللَّهِ, right? The nafi of la ilaha, this is tanzih. يعني أي لا متصف بمعنى من معاني الألوهية إلا الله, right? Because that's not the formal definition of لا إله إلا الله, but what's understood لا إله أي يعني لا ذات متصفة بصفات الألوهية إلا الله, right? Now, and that is لا معبود بحق إلا الله. Right? There is none, no entity, nor any with the attributes, nor any with the actions of that one. Now, what is being negated by لا إله is لا قديم إلا الله, لا باقي إلا الله, لا غنية إلا الله, right? القيام بالنفس, which also something called غناء. لا مخالفة لما عداه إلا الله, لا واحدة إلا الله, right? The five attributes of negation, right? These five sifat that are the sifat يعني السلبية. Now, the sifat السلبية then are يعني هي عبارة عن ما يليق بالذات الواجب الوجود, are negating those meanings that are unbefitting the necessary existent, subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? So, مدلولها السلب, right? Or مدلولها النفي, right? Their indication is of negation, negating that which is unbecoming for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Unbecoming a سلب ما يستحيل في حق الله subhanahu wa ta'ala, is to negate that which is absurd for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So that is, and this, if you want to see a beautiful example of this, and one of the texts that is good to keep قرب المتناول, not far from us, is the Aqidah al-Tahawiyah. And you find beautiful statements of oneness. What does he say? فنقول في توحيد الله موقنين بتوفيق من الله أو بتوفيق الله أن الله واحد, that Allah is one, لا شريك له, He has no partner, that is لا شيء مثله, there is nothing like Him, ولا شيء يعجزه, and nothing incapacitates Him, ولا إله غيره, and there is no God but Him, قديم بلا ابتداء, قدم, دائم بلا انتهاء, right? Eternal without end, لا يفنى ولا يبيد. That's ta'keed. He does not perish nor cease to be. ولا يكون إلا ما يريد. And only that which he wills comes to pass. And then he makes tawqid. لا تبلغه الأوهام ولا تدركه الأفهام, etc., etc., etc. Right? All of these other things. All of it returning to this emphasis on tanzih. The emphasis on tanzih, right? You see it in so many du'as and dhikrs of the Prophet ﷺ, right? When one of the important adhkar that we're commanded to say by morning and by night, what is it? To say 10 times, La ilaha illallah, wahdahu la sharika lah, lahul mulk wa lahul hamd, yuhyi wa yumit. And in some narrations that are sound, huwa hayyun la yamut, biyadihi al-khair, wa huwa ala kulli shay'in qadir. Right? This dhikr that we say in the morning and by night, and the Prophet ﷺ tells us about how encompassing it is in wiping away sin and in preserving of faith. Why? Because that dhikr that we say by morning and night, we repeat it 10 times. What does it do? If you write it out explicitly and by indication and by clear indication, all the attributes of negation are there and all the affirmative attributes as well. Similarly, the tasbihs, subhanallah. Subhanallah, the primary indication of tasbih, right? Glory be to Allah. Actually, the way Shaykh Nuh Keller translates that by meaning is, exalted is my Lord beyond all limits. Right? The primary indication of it is tanzih. والمنزه متصف بصفات الكمال. Right? So its primary indication is the Allah's exaltedness beyond all imperfection, which are, subhanallah affirms all the attributes of negation. So what do we intend when we say subhanallah? Subhanallah. No. All these meanings, right? Subhanallah al-Qadim, Subhanallah al-Baqi, Subhanallah al-Ghani, Subhanallah al-Munazzah, yani al-Mukhalif lima siwa, Subhanallah al-Wahid. Right? These 5 attributes of negation. Similarly, Subhanallah, the one who's characterized by the attributes of affirmation. Alhamdulillah. Hamd, Allah is deserving all praise. Its primary indication is thubuti. It affirms the attributes of perfection, but it entails His being exalted beyond all imperfections. Right? So when you say Subhanallah, Alhamdulillah, and Allahu Akbar. Why is Allah the absolutely great? Same. Because He is Al-Qadim, Al-Baqi, Al-Ghani, Al-Munazzah, Al-Wahid. Allahu Akbar, because of His ilm, His irada, His qudra, His sam'a, His basar, His kalam, His hayat, of course, etc. Right? So these attributes, all the adhkar we do are grounded in these meanings. When we say La ilaha illallah, right? And as it's mentioned, and this is a good point of review, right? La ilaha illallah contains within it وَيَنْطَوِي فِي كِلْمَةِ الْإِسْلَامِ مَا قَدْ مَضَى مِنْ سَائِرِ الْأَحْكَامِ, as Imam al-Dardir says in the Kharida. Right? La ilaha, this is all the attributes of negation. Okay. And it affirms all the attributes of perfection. La ilaha illallah. And Muhammadun Rasulullah affirms the sifat not only of the prophets, but Muhammadun Rasulullah, he came with a risala that tells us about the sifat of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It's from Muhammadun Rasulullah that we know about as-sam'u wal-basar wal-kalam. And through Muhammad Rasulullah we know all the matters of the hereafter. Right? And there's a beautiful summary, and Imam Dardir does it in the Kharida, based on, in his commentary on the Kharida, based on what Imam As-Sanusi, for example, mentioned in his Barahin, right? Right? So that is an important, these are connections to make. Here I'd recommend, connecting with that, because the Sifat al-Salbiya, and we look at the Sifat, how do we gain consciousness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala through these? That these are ma'ani, these are means by which we know Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? And we increase in consciousness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? So, line 23, فواجب له الوجود والقدم كذا بقاء لا يشاب بالعدم. قوله القدم قال الإمام أحمد الصاوي رحمه الله تعالى في شرحه ونفعنا به وبكم: هذا شروع منه في أول الصفات السلبية، وهي أي الصفات السلبية 5، وتسمى أي عند البعض مهمات الأمهات، لأنه يلزم من نفي ضد هذه ال5 تنزيهه تعالى عن جميع النقائص. Right? Right? So these are also called صفات التنزيه. So he said this is a beginning to look at the first of the attributes of negation, and these are 5, and they're also called the ummahat, the foundation of the foundations, the foundations of the foundations, right? And because the tanzihat are many, what is negated is much more than this, but all of them go back to this, and the foundation of affirming what we affirm about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is to negate سلب ما يليق بذاته تعالى. Right? And that's a useful working definition. الصفات السلبية يعني عبارة عن سلب ما لا يليق بذاته تعالى. In this, of course, one of those books that a talib ilm should strive to read at some point in their life, and Imam al-Kawthari said it should be written with gold ink on pages of silver, etc., is Imam Fakhruddin al-Razi's work, Asas al-Taqdees, the foundation of sanctity. Right? It's an amazing book. Ironically, someone who didn't particularly like Imam Fakhruddin al-Razi wrote a book called Naqdu Asas al-Taqdees, a refutation of the foundations of divine sanctity. It's a very unfortunate title, and it's by someone who is accused of falling into that which resembles or is tashbih. Anyways, so he gives us now a definition of qidam. وَمَعْنَى الْقِدَمِ في حقه سبحانه وتعالى عدم الأولية أو عدم افتتاح الوجود. So عدم الأولية, this one definition. Right? العدم الأولية أو عدم افتتاح الوجود. Right? عدم الأولية أي لا يعني so عدم الأولية أي لوجوده. His existence does not have a beginning. Right? And they're similar. فالقديم هو الذي لا أول له أو الذي لا افتتاح لوجوده. Right? القديم, right? So now there's an underlying question that some would raise, that if you look in the Quran, has the name or attribution Al-Qadim come for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? La. So this is a problem. There are some hadiths that mention this. Ya Qadim al-Ihsan, etc. There's a few individual narrations that mention it. Now, we have to appreciate We'll see later he says, وَاخْتِيرَ أَنَّ أَسْمَاءَهُ تَوْقِيفِيَّة. Right? What's the line? وكذا صفات ذاته العالية سنية فاحفظ السمعية. Right? واختير, it is chosen that his واختير أن أسماءه توقيفية. Right? That the names of Allah are توقيفي. They're only established by transmission. كذا الصفات. Likewise, his attributes. فاحفظ السمعية. So memorize what has been transmitted. Because the Prophet ﷺ tells us in the hadith on the 99 names that Allah has 99 names, 100 less one. من أحصاها دخل الجنة. من أحصاها. Right? Imam Ahmad Zarruq mentions in his Sharh on the Asma' Allah al-Husna, there's 5 meanings for ahsaha. But one thing to appreciate always is that there's a farq between something that is generally true and something that is absolutely true. That's a logical thing, we see it in logic. So you say that, if you say that I like steak, let's say you like steak, but do you like burnt steak? No. Right? Do you like steak that is stale? No. Right? Something's generally true is different from something that is absolutely true. The example, and we'll see it when in Idah al-Mubham, the commentator at the Manhuri, he mentions the example, if you say, Ahlul Azhar ulama. This is a general statement. This is very different from saying, Kullu Azhariyin alim. Every Azhari is a alim. The first is a general statement. Like in the general statement, are there things that are excluded from it? Yes. لِاعْتِبَارات. Okay. So the Manhur says, وَفِيهِمْ مَنْ لَمْ يَشُمَّ رَائِحَةَ الْعِلْمِ. Because amongst those who, Ahl Azhar, there are those who've not even smelt the scent of knowledge. Okay? They say, Azhari. Al-Baraka, yani. Right? But if you say, كُلُّ أزهري عالم, خلاص, يحتمل الإخراج, that there's things that are not in it. That's why in Arabic you have تأكيد. فسجد الملائكة كلهم أجمعون. Because سجد الملائكة, this is عموما. Maybe some malaika were out on errands, they didn't. They say كلهم. خلاص. But sometimes you make multiple ta'keed because there's so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's, why would the ulama then not say awwal? Because different i'tibarat. Because the Quranic term is huwa al-awwal wal-akhir wal-zahir wal-batin, for example, right? And one is that to highlight what is meant by al-awwaliyya fi haqqihi ta'ala, right? To clarify. Because awwaliyya, because huwa al-awwal wal-akhir, right? Right? What's to clarify that al-awwal bima'na al-qadim, right? Al-qadim. And there's different i'tibarat that they found useful, right? That they use that terminologically. Whereas awwal is used in many other contexts. Right? So they chose a less commonly used word for the terminological purpose. But the asma, we wouldn't say, like we wouldn't, someone has a child, like someone's a theologian, right? They study theology, they call their son Abdul Qadim. You say la. Because the asma, right? Because here the sifat, we're using it in a terminological way. Okay, bismillah. وَهَلِ الْأَزَلِ مُرَادِفٌ لِلْقَدِيمِ. Because this qidam and azal, are they mutaradif? Broadly, there are three positions. Different ulama use these terms in different ways. Right? وهل الأزلي مرادف للقديم. Muradif is the term azali, synonymous to the qadim. Says this is what was said by Ibn al-Tilimsani, right? Who died in the year 644. وأئمة اللغة, and the scholars of the Arabic language, that القديم والأزلي من لا أول له. Right? فهما ما لا أول له عدميا كان أو وجوديا. So something that does not have a beginning, it can be called azali or qadim. Whether it is something non-existent. So for example, وجود الشريك يعني منفي يعني في القدم وفي الأزل. And it's عدمي. الشريك عدمي. الوجودي, like existence of Allah. Right? This is azali, you can call it azali or qadim. قائما بنفسه, whether it exists by itself, like the entity of Allah, أو لا, or it subsists through His entity, like the sifat. Right? And you can see the footnotes, right? But this is one usage. The second usage, وقال السعد. السعد being سعد الدين التفتازاني. Right? مسعود ibn Umar ibn Abdullah سعد الدين التفتازاني, were the greatest of the imams of علم الكلام, of علم العقائد, the author of شرح العقائد. Right? شرح العقائد النسفية, the author of تهذيب المنطق والكلام, the author of المقاصد in علم الكلام and its شرح المقاصد. These are three of the most important of works. An imam, one of the greatest of the imams and he lived in the 8th century. He died 791. فالتفتازاني was an imam he's a referential imam in ilm al-kalam, especially because at the level of teaching, classically, everybody would study sharh al-aqaid. The aqaid al-nasafiyya by Imam Najm al-Din Abu Hafs al-Nasafi from the 6th century, and this commentary, she says sharh al-aqaid, you don't need to explain whose sharh on which aqaid. It's known, sharh al-aqaid. And as a reference work, Sharh al-Maqasid. And in Mantiq, he's a referential imam. His Tahdhib al-Mantiq wal-Kalam, and that's in both Mantiq and Kalam, but especially in Mantiq. But he's also in Balagha, the standard teaching. It's rare, like if you look at a curriculum of Islamic studies, if we look at the Dars-e-Nizami, for example, or the Ottoman curriculum or the Iraqi curriculum, there's nobody who features more in across the major curricula, what used to be there at Azhar, than Sa'd al-Din al-Taftazani. Because the referential work in Kalam is his, Sharh al-Aqaid. The referential work in Balagha is his, Mukhtasar al-Ma'ani, as a teaching text. The referential work in one of the referential work commentaries, which is a supporting work in Sarf. So in Sarf, they study Al-Izzi, Al-Bina and Al-Izzi, etc. On Al-Izzi, the standard commentary is Sa'd al-Din al-Taftazani. In Mantiq, in many curricula, in Iraq, the Ottomans, many places, the Kurds, etc. In Mantiq, a level 2 or a third level book would be Tahdhib al-Mantiq wal-Kalam. Let alone the reference works. In Balagha al-Atwal, In Balagha, Sa'ad al-Din al-Taftazani. Right? In Kalam, of the referential works like Sharh al-Maqasid, etc. Brilliant, brilliant scholar. Differed upon between the Hanafis and the Shafi'is. Was he Hanafi or was he Shafi'i? It's not that important insofar as his focus was the ulum al-aqliyah. Oh, in usul al-fiqh, the key teaching text in, at the higher level, like for example the hidayah level text in usul al-fiqh is at-tawdih. على التنقيح. And it's always taught with the hashiyah of Sa'ad al-Din al-Taftazani, التلويح. Right? So across this whole spectrum of rational sciences, there's nobody who comes close to that as being, like you live with Sa'ad al-Din al-Taftazani in a classical curriculum of Islamic studies. The fact that he's less famous now is just because Sa'ad al-Din al-Taftazani wrote for smart people. And the classical curriculum was meant to build smart people. But then people dumbed it down, and then we have dumbed down students. Nas'allahu al-afiyah. But al-Taftazani, and of course, we mentioned the story before, but بذكر الصالحين تتنزل الرحمات. Taftazani was the dumbest student in the classes of his teacher, Imam Adud al-Din al-Iji. And we can find the actual story, it's mentioned. If you look in the biographies, if you look around, you'll find it. Do a little bit of shamila searching. Sa'ad al-Din was the dumbest student in his teacher's class. Like, كان يضرب به المثل, used to be used as the example of someone who doesn't get it. He put up his hand, everybody would laugh. But he was consistent in his dars. He would always prepare. He would always participate. He would always ask questions. He would always review. But literally, put up his hand, everyone started laughing. He speaks, even the teacher would laugh. Right? But he stuck with it. And there's a lesson there on من صبر ظفر, that whoever remains steadfast attains. What's sabr? الثبات على مرضات الله, remaining firm on the good pleasure of Allah. And he genuinely wanted it. He had he had himma, even though he didn't have intelligence or ability at that time. But then there's also the power of hubbullahi wa rasulih and ta'zeem. Because he had a dream. He had 3 nights in a row, he had a dream that he was in a shed, and someone comes, knocks on the door and says, come with me to the forest. He said, I can't, I have dars tomorrow with Sa'ad al-Din. Long story. So he didn't go. 2nd day, 3rd day. Then the man came again and said, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam saying that I have been calling you for 3 days and you haven't come. So he was worried. And he went with the man, rushed and overwhelmed and متغلب على حاله, like this, just overwhelmed. And he entered the forest, and there's a clearing in the forest. And there's a group of munawwar people standing together. And the Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam turned to him and he said, Ya Sa'ad, da'awnaka wa lam tastajib. Said, oh, Ya Sa'ad, we called you and you didn't come. Say, Ya Rasulullah. And he just emptied his heart out to the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. I didn't know you were calling and this and this and this and this and this. The Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam smiled and he put his blessed hand on Sa'ad al-Din al-Taftazani. I forget. And the narrations, I think, actually differ. Put it on his chest or on his shoulder. Either way, he woke up, he was very happy. Because man ra'ani faqad ra'a al-haqq, because the Prophet ﷺ said, whoever has seen me has seen the truth, فَإِنَّ الشَّيْطَانَ لَا يَتَمَثَّلُ بِي. Right? And of course, as Abdullah ibn Rawaha points out in a line of poetry of his, right? He says, له راحة. He talk about يروح الفداء لمن أخلاقه شهدت بأنه خير مولود من البشر لو لم تكن فيه آيات مبينة لكانت بديهته تغني عن الخبر. And he says له راحة لو أن معشار جودها على البر لكان البر أندى من البحر. He has a hand. If even a tenth of its generosity fell upon dry land, the dry land would be wetter than the oceans. But he didn't come to be generous to dry land. He came for dead hearts to bring them to life. من كان ميتا فأحييناه. Right? He went to Sa'ad al-Din to Al-Iji's class, raised his hands, everyone chuckled, started speaking, everyone was silent. Because suddenly, this is a totally different Sa'ad. And he participated, everyone's stunned. What happened? Just yesterday, you know. Afterwards, Al-Iji called and said, Ya Sa'ad, you're not the same Sa'ad you were yesterday. Of course, Al-Iji is the author of Al-Mawaqif. And the Al-Mawaqif is commented upon, most notably by the arch enemy, or the nemesis of Al-Taftazani, which is As-Sayyid Al-Sharif Al-Jurjani. Anyways, and As-Sayyid Al-Sharif Al-Jurjani, the author of At-Ta'rifat, one of the greatest dictionaries of definitions. He's the author of Sharh Al-Mawaqif, and the author of great works as well. And they both wrote important works in tafsir as well. Hawashi on different things. Al-Jurjani also has Hawashi in different. They had at least three major debates. And the final one was the cause of the death of At-Taftazani. Because they mentioned, and sometimes they say, جُرْحُ الْأَقْرَانِ لَا يُلْتَفَتْ إِلَيْهِ, that the criticism of contemporaries is ignored. Because just the nature of people that they will differ. The Sahaba differed. وَنُحْسِنِ الظَّنْ بِالْجَمِيعِ, because the nature of life is that people will see things differently. Sincere people, especially if they're intelligent, are going to see things differently. They're likely to be passionate about what they hold to be true. So at some point, they may well part ways. They may well disagree. They may well disagree intensely, and that's the haqiqah of ما شجر بين الصحابة, and that's indicative of their commitment to the truth, not questionable. And so the first debate, everybody attended, between Sa'ad and As-Sayyid. But it was very technical. First debate, even the Awam attended and the Ulama. First debate happened, the Awam didn't understand what was going on. So second debate, the Awam didn't attend, but the Ulama attended. But the second debate, they say, even the Ulama didn't understand except the Muhaqqiqeen amongst them. Like those who are specialized in Kalam and Usul and so on. The third debate, only the specialized scholars came. And this is under the patronage of the local ruler, etc. The third debate, the person who was supposed to, and the first two debates were a draw. The third debate, the scholar who was judging between them had very strong love for Ahl al-Bayt. But nobody who was in attendance really understood the subtleties of what was going on. But the scholar who was adjudicating between them, who was certainly not at their level, they said he probably didn't know what was going on either. He said that Sayyid al-Sharif al-Jurjani won the debate, and Taftazani was deeply, deeply sorrowed by that. And he died a couple of weeks later. And they differ. It would appear that Sa'ad al-Din Taftazani was Shafi'i al-Madhab, but he was a master also in the Hanafi school, as his work in Hanafi Usul would indicate. Shaykh Abdul Fattah Abu Ghudda has extensive discussion on this point. Although there's difference. So interestingly, but they say this in general, ulama sometimes get passionate. The talweeh ala tawdeeh has, which is a hashiyah, it itself has commentaries upon it by many people. Mullah Khusro has a hashiyah on the talweeh, many others. Amongst them, a scholar from Central Asia, Al-Marjani, who came at a very troubled time in Central Asia and was deeply opinionated. He wrote a hashiyah, and Omar, if you can dig up just it's Hawashi ala talweeh, right? And he's got Mullah Khusro and this and that. I'm not suggesting you look at that, but it's really funny because Al-Marjani is convinced that we have a Shafi'i scholar who decided to write a work on the most important work in usul in the Hanafi school. And his only purpose is to make the Hanafis look bad. And that opening 2 pages of Al-Marjani's hashiyah on the talweeh, it's an amazing example of eloquence in attacking. It says he's come, in hiding to shake our foundations and weaken our proofs and make us look absurd. And then the whole text, especially if you contrast it, because there's, I think, 3 or 4 hawashi together. The others are explaining the words of At-Taftazani, and it's considered one of the greatest works in Hanafi usul. Like the tawdeeh is never published, typically, without a talweeh of At-Taftazani. But Al-Marjani, everywhere. And I think 85-90% of the corrections are either incorrect or unfair. Or there's just a tadqiq غير المحتاج. So why did he say this? Should have said it this way. That's totally unfair. Right? Anyways, Sa'ad al-Din al-Taftazani, but he is one of the great imams of Islam. قال السعد الأزلي أعم من القديم. The term أزلي is more general than al-Qadim. Both refer to eternal. إذ القديم ما قام بنفسه ولا أول لوجوده. Because the Qadim is that which subsists through itself and has no beginning. Right? وَالْأَزَلِ مَا لَا أَوَّلَ لَهُ. And the Azali is that which has no beginning, عَدَمِيًا أَوْ وُجُودِيًا. Whether it is something that is non-existent, كالشريك لله تعالى كالشريك، أو وجوديا قائما بنفسه كالذات، أو بالذات العلية كالصفات. Right? Whether it subsists through itself or by the entity, like attributes. So there's a number of ways to and these are different matters of terminology. فصفات الله تعالى يقال لها أزلية. So Allah's attributes, we say they're أزلي. يقال لها, this is على هذا القول. Right? On this second opinion. Right? ولا يقال لها قديمة. And one does not say they're قديم. والأعدام أزلية كذلك. But things that don't exist are called azali, but not called qadim. Simple way to retain this is just diagram it. Al-azali wal-qadim. Right? So there's one opinion that is that it's mutaradif. Right? Mutaradif, they're synonymous. This was said by Ibn Tilimsani. This is what's also chosen by Imam Al-Bajuri. Both, yeah. You can find it in Bajuri, either on Tuhfat al-Murid or in Hashiyat al-Sanusiyya, or both, maybe, right? But But these are matters of istilah. This is terminology. In the Arabic language, they're broadly synonymous. But they want to, when talking, especially in going to subtle matters, it doesn't hurt. So you say, okay, at a simple level, qadim and azali is the same thing. But why should we know about the other opinion? Because many of the great scholars differentiated in you talk about one and the other. So it's good to be aware, and when you take notes, you try to remember that they're essentially synonymous, but there's some tafsil. So that if you read a more advanced book, say, هذا في القديم بخلاف الأزلي. This is referred to the qadim as opposed to the azali. You're like, but they're the same. So you know that, oh, there's a distinction. What is it? Right? So, that's why this kind of stuff, diagramming it helps retain the two. أما ذات الله تعالى فيقال لها أزلية قديمة. As for the entity of Allah, it is called azali and qadim. Right? Both ancient and eternal. ودليله, okay? دليله أي دليل القدم. The paragraphing, of course, is really bad here. Right? دليله أي دليل القدم. So this is a separate investigation. Right? It doesn't hurt even in your copy to put like subtitles yourself in the margin. Right? So in the first part, he said, right? So you could put, and this is useful, in the margin you put يعني الصفات السلبية, right? That's the first thing, right? Right? Then he تعريف القدم, right? He gives a definition of القدم. Then the issue of هل الأزلي مرادف للقديم. Right? And putting these subtitles like this, each topic helps, because when you're reviewing, like you go through, say, okay, الصفات السلبية, do I know what they are? Yes. تعريف القديم, do I know it? Yes. هل الأزلي مرادف للقديم, do I know it? Yes. And this helps when taking your notes, right? And some people have submitted their notes recently. There's no point in just writing out the text, right? Like chunks. You have to break it down logically, right? A lot more. Each different topic, put it in a different line. And it helps to give your own subtitles, whatever. It's useful to write it out anyways. Right? And then the separate thing, which is now dalil sifat al-qidam. What is the proof that Allah has the attribute of qidam? Right? Now, of course, these are all logically arranged. If Allah is wajib al-wujud لا يكون إلا قديما. Simple. Right? هو واجب الوجود. That's why the mabhath al-wujud is so important. Understanding existence is so important. The ulama found this is the most airtight. If you can affirm that Allah exists and His existence is necessary, everything else is built upon His existence being necessary. That's why there's a logical order between these, right? وَدَلِيلُهُ أي دليل القدم أنه لو لم يكن قديما كان حادثا. If Allah were not eternal, He would be originated. وَلَوْ كَانَ حادثا لَافْتَقَرَ إلى محدث. And if he were originated, He would require an originator. وَلَوْ افتقر إلى محدث. If He needed an originator, لافتقر محدثه إلى محدث أي آخر. And if He needed an originator, His originator would need another originator. وهكذا. And so on. فيلزم الدور. And you'd have either circularity, A was created by B, B was created by C, C was created by D, but D was created by A. So you have circularity, which is absurd. أو التسلسل, or infinite regress. وتقدم بطلانهما, and both are absurd. Right? And we saw that. And they say, وَمَا أَدَّى إِلَى مُحَال فَهُوَ مُحَال. And anything that necessarily entails the absurd is itself absurd. So that's qidam. Right? And كذا البقاء قوله كذا بقاء قوله كذا بقاء هو في حقه تعالى عدم الآخرية أو عدم افتتاح الوجود. Right? So he gives two definitions. Right? His being everlasting is with respect to Allah Most High, there being no ending or no end point to his existence. Right? But we took that. Did we share the thing from the Tariq al-Muhammadiyya about this? Yes, so we should post it. Right? The quote from Ayn al-Qudat al-Hamadani, that both qidam and baqa, but adam iftitah al-wujud is not because his existence is not an ongoing succession of moments in the past nor in the future. That is relative eternity. And that's the farq. And this is important with respect to baqa, because what is also eternal? Heaven and hell are eternal. But what is their eternity? This is baqa'un mustamad. This is, heaven remains in existence, يبقى بقاء مستمدا بإبقاء الله سبحانه وتعالى إياه. It is sustained by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? What's the ruling of the existence of heaven? What is it? What kind of necessary? It's hadith, but in itself, the existence of heaven is what? Mumkin, right? Heaven did not have to exist. It's in itself possible. But do we believe in it? Yes. So it's wajib. It's called wajib aradi. It's contingently necessary. Right? So it's mumkin fi nafsihi. It's in itself possible. Wajib, right? Wajib right? Aradi, contingently necessary. Right? Okay. Contingently necessary. It's baqi, right? But this baqa is baqa'un mustamad. This is a succession of moments, right? So we have, these are there's more types of eternity, right? There's more types of eternity, but two basic ones. There's absolute eternity, which is the eternity of Allah. قديم بلا ابتداء دائم بلا انتهاء منزه بالتنزيه عن الزمان عن الزمنية. And then there's a relative eternity, which is of that which was possible. Allah brings it into existence and Allah sustains it on an ongoing basis towards no discernible end. But it's within alam al-imkan. Right? And there's no point of comparison between that and the existence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now there's an ishkal. إن قلت إن وجوب الوجود يغني عن القدم والبقاء. that affirming that Allah is the necessary existence frees us of need of affirming that He is beginningless and endless. بل والمخالفة للحوادث. And if you say He's wajib al-wujud, then you don't have to say He's distinct from creation. Because khalas, that's enough. أجيب بأنه وإن كان يغني. Says, yes, even if it is sufficient for mentioning these, لكنه بالمعنى الالتزامي. But these meanings are entailed. This is ilzam, right? يعني what we'll be seeing in منطق ونسبة الألفاظ للمعاني ثلاثة. The relationships between words and meaning are three, right? Which are تضمن, which are مطابقة, تضمن, and التزام, right? So Shaykh Adib likes to say مطابقة is like this, right? A equals B, مطابقة, and طبق is one thing that is on top of another, right? The Malaysians and others have, what's that dish called? Mutabbaq, right? Because it's two slices of bread of some kind that are together. It's mutabbaq, right? طبقا عن طبق, layers upon layers, right? فمطابقة is correspondence. A equals B. Then you have تضمن, which is A is B because A is, or because B is part of A, right? التوبة الندم, because B is part of A, or vice versa, right? That, you say الإنسان حيوان. B, is being حيوان, is part of the mafhum, the meaning of the word insan. And the third is iltizam, that if you say A, B is entailed by it. So B is not A itself, and B is not part of A, but it's iltizam. So for example, what's a classical example they use? Well, if we look at the hadith of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, right? If you look in Kitab al-Iman, what is Iman? The Prophet said, إن إطعام الطعام وإفشاء السلام. And he said, أطعم الطعام وصل الأرحام وافشوا السلام. So أطعم الطعام وأفشوا السلام وصلوا الأرحام وصلوا بالليل والناس نيام تدخل الجنة بسلام. He said, I asked about Iman. He said, give salam. He said, what? Feed others. Your neighbor feeds others. Is he a mu'min? No. He says, Assalamu alaikum. Does that make him Muslim? No. Are you Egyptian? May Allah forgive. Lots of Christian Palestinians. Do they ever give you salam? Okay. Well, I know a lot of Christian Palestinians and Christian Egyptians. They'll say Assalamu alaikum too. Do they maintain family ties? Yeah. So let's say some Palestinian Christian. He gives salams. He feeds others, gives salams, maintain family ties. Does that make him a mu'min? No. Sallu bil-layl wa nasu niyam. That's a little tougher, right? Right? What is the relationship between Iman and these things that the Prophet ﷺ mentioned? This is dilalat iltizam. A is B, in that B is entailed by A. It's not داخل في ماهيته. It's not عبارة عن الماهية, which is the دليل المطابقة. It's not the thing itself, and it's not جزءا من المفهوم. So it's تمام المفهوم دلالة اللفظ على ما وافق يسمى بدلالة what's it? بدلالة المطابقة, right? And part of the meaning is is تضمن. دلالة الشيء على جزء معناه. We'll come to that. That's why logic is important. But A is B, and then B is entailed by A. Right? لا إيمان لمن لا أمانة له. What's the relationship between iman and amana? Is amana iman itself? No. Is amana part of iman? No. Because iman is a mafhum basit, not murakkab. Iman is a singular concept, it's tasdeeq. So what's the relation between iman and amana? That iman necessarily should necessarily shar'an, and Hanafi say aqlan wa shar'an, entail amana. فمن اتصف بالإيمان ولم يتصف بالأمانة فقد أخل بلوازم الإيمان. But doesn't make them kafir. That whoever has iman but doesn't have this what necessarily entailed by it, it's not that their iman itself is in question, but what should be entailed by it is not there. So there's something needing fixing. So this is iltizam. So if we say wajib al-wujud, it entails being without beginning and without end. Because al-wajib ma la yaqbalu al-intifa'. Right? The necessary is that which does not accept negation. It is that which is, must be, and cannot not be. So خلاص. وعلماء هذا الفن, but the scholars of this science of عقيدة لحساسيته, because of how sensitive it is, لا يكتفون بدلالة الالتزام, don't limit themselves to what is entailed by things. لزيادة الإيضاح, for the purpose of clarity. Right? لدقة هذه المعاني, because the subtlety of these meanings. And also because they're not from the things that are mahsusa, they're not tangible things. Like if I say this table, I got this table. Do I need to say it's black? He said whatever color it is, like broadly speaking. What would you describe this as? What would you guys describe this as? Black? Whatever. Right? Women tend to have more complicated, sophisticated names for colors. But it's black. Right? But something that is tangible, we don't need to say, and it has legs shaped this way, because if I say this table, khalas, the other things are understood. What is the table for? Because this is within the parameters of our aql al-qiyasi, the things that our intellect is familiar with. But the ma'ani, and most intellects aren't, we are used to dealing with the mahsusat. The ma'ani, most intellects are not accustomed to thinking, and the chance of them slipping in the ma'qulat are more serious. والدليل على ثبوت البقاء أنه لو جاز عليه طرو العدم لاستحال عليه القدم، لأن ما جاز عدمه استحال قدمه، كما تقدم في قول المصنف وكل ما جاز عليه العدم عليه قطعا يستحيل القدم. So the proof that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is endless, has the attribute of baqa, endlessness, that if it was possible for him to cease to exist, it would be absurd to affirm that he is beginningless. Because al-qadim la yakunu illa wajib al-wujud. Because the beginningless could only be a necessary existent. Okay? لأن من جاز عدمه, because any for whom it is possible not to exist, استحال قدمه, could not be endless. Because ما جاز عدمه كان جائز الوجود. Because anything for which it is possible not to be is simply possible of existence. So they're possible of existence, they could not be eternal in the absolute sense, right? قدمه أي قدما ذاتيا. Because if they were قديم, يعني قدمه قدما ذاتيا, right? As we have seen when the author discussed, and if you can review those lines, everything for it's possible not to exist, it is absolutely absurd for it to be eternal. أو يقال, another line of reasoning, لو لم يتصف بوجوب البقاء, were he not characterized by it being obligatory to be endless, بقاء, لا جاز عليه العدم, then it would be possible for him to not exist. So فيكون من قبل الممكن, then he would be merely possible. ولو جاز عليه العدم لكان حادثا, then he would be originated. إلى آخر دليل القدم, the same proof. فدليله إما القدم نفسه, so the proof of his being, having بقاء, is either the proof of قدم itself, أو دليله, or the proof of its قدم. كذا بقاء لا يشاب بالعدم, untouched by what's Adam? Untouched by any of the meanings of non-being. Right? أي لا يخالطه العدم ولا يلحقه. Non-existence does not admix with Allah nor affect him in any way. And this is with respect to Allah's entity, his attributes, and his actions. Right? And that's why we have, because something that is and then ceases to be, this meaning of occurring and non-occurring. What is that? Where does that take place? When there's time. Right? When there's time. If there's time, that is من صفات الحوادث, من صفات الممكن, not القديم. Right? So some of, alhamdulillah, I try to be discerning when, some khatib say, Allah speaks if He wills and is silent if He wills. Okay? And if we say that Allah's speech is what? Is an eternal attribute. That's just an absurd thing to say. Okay? Like, what do you mean by speech? كذلك بقاء لا يشاب بالعدم. The baqa refers to Allah's entity and His attributes. Right? And His actions. And we'll look at the issue of the actions of Allah when we come to it. فبقاء الله تعالى لا يقارن بزمان. The eternity of Allah is untouched by time. This is a really important concept, right? Right? And a lot of people, when they talk about Allah didn't answer my dua, Allah didn't, and there's an amazing hikmah of Ibn Ata'illah. He says, عنايته فيك لا لشيء منك. Allah's concern for you is not from something from you. إذ أين كنت حيث واجهتك عنايته وخصصتك رعايته أو كما قال. Because where were you when His concern was directed towards you and when His care related to you? Right? بل وسائر صفاته. Right? And likewise all His attributes. يعني ما صح إطلاقه على الله تعالى صفة لابد أن يصح إطلاقه عليه قدما. Right? Anything that is sound to affirm for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as an attribute must necessarily be sound to attribute eternally to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. لأن زمان, because what is zaman? So here he gives us a definition of zaman, right? And we won't go into too much in this because we're going to get distracted by it, right? Zaman is a succession of moments, and they relate to that, and moments are characteristic of things that are within time. Time is a relationship between different moments of existing things. State A of existing things, state B between existing things. Right? And how do we measure state A to state B? This is time. Right? الزمان إما مقارنة متجدد موهوم لمتجدد معلوم. The متجدد معلوم is state A. Right? Right? So the pen is here. A second later, pen is here. Right? This duration, this is zaman. There's something given to change, and a second thing. That, and there's more sophisticated ways of describing this, but أو حركة الفلك, or time is the motion of the celestial being, celestial entities, the falak. وكلاهما حادث, and all of these, what it measures, state A to state B, this originated. ولا يقترن بالمتجدد والحادث إلا ما كان مثلهما, and nothing relates to this succession of moments and the originated except something that is like them, that is itself bound by a succession of moments and is itself originated. فليس له أجل. Right? So فليس له أي فليس لبقاء الله تعالى أجل. So the eternity of Allah, right, or His endlessness, does not have a time period. أجل, time period. بخلاف بقاء غيره, contrary to the eternity. So Allah's eternity is absolute. He has القدم والبقاء المطلق. Right? As opposed to the eternity of other than Allah, فإنه مخالط بالعدم, because it is affected by عدم. ومقرون بالزمان, and because heaven and hell did not exist. They came into existence, and it is a succession of moments. And it is مفتقر, حادث مفتقر. It's originated and in need of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? كُلًّا نُمِدْ, all do we sustain. Okay? So there's wujud is wujud mustamid, right? And there's some call it wujudun ata'i, it's granted. Heaven and hell have no intrinsic reality, right? كما أن قدمه تعالى ذاتي. This says Allah's beginninglessness is intrinsic, ذاتي. لا يتصور العقل عدمه. The intellect, meaning the sound intellect, cannot conceive of its non-being. The commentators on the Sanusiyya, Imam Bajuri in his Hashiyah, but also Al-Dasuqi, others, talk about this issue, like in the Hukm Aqli, لا يتصور العقل, that what is meant by the Al-Aql is not the intellect of any Joe Schmo. He says, well, I could think about all kinds of things. This is العقل السليم, يعني الذي يحكم حكما سليما على الأشياء, or the sound intellect, right? That the intellect is the tool for discernment. So the sound intellect, if it judged soundly using sound judgment, إثبات أمر لأمر, given that things have realities, those realities are affirmed and noble, etc., then يعني حكما صحيحا أي مطابقا للواقع, with a sound judgment that corresponds to what is. كما أن قدم غيره زماني. As for the أما قدم غيره فزماني. As for the eternity of other things, this is time bound. It's a succession of moments. فيقال بناء قديم, an ancient building. يعني طال زمنه. This is relative. It's a basic concept that in anything we affirm for Allah and we affirm for creation, when we affirm it for Allah, we affirm it absolutely. What's the rahmah of Allah? It's absolute. Do you have rahmah? Yes or no? Yes. But it is relative. Right? So there's no, there is no comparison. Right? As a basic concept, the absolute and the relative. Right? The only thing you cannot affirm in that sense is uluhiyya. Right? Uluhiyya. The other thing, even rahmah, rahmaniyya, because the madlul of rahmaniyya is encompassing absolute mercy. And the abd ajiz an hadha al-ma'na. That's absurd to affirm for Allah. But in itself, the other names can be ascribed to creation. And then some say some of the sifat of jalal are unbecoming. Right? Right? But generally people are smart enough not to say that they're mutakabbir, muta'ali, etc. Right? 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 فالأقسام ثلاثة. So there's three categories of things with respect to eternity. شيء لا أول له ولا آخر وهو ذات الله تعالى وصفاته. Something that has no beginning nor end. And this is وهو مستغني عن الزمنية. Right? And it's transcendent beyond time, and that's the entity and attributes of Allah. وشيء له أول وآخر. And something that has a beginning and end. وهو الدنيا. It's this life. Right? وشيء له أول ولا آخر له. And something has a beginning but has no end. كالجنة والنار وما فيهما. لكن this is, but we say that, so this is فقدمه وبقاؤه ذاتي. The first category, its beginningless and endlessness is eternal, right? And what else do we say about it? It's dhati, number one, and it's munazzah عن الزمان, right? Right? قدمه ذاتي, you can also say mutlaq, right? It's intrinsic, dhati, mutlaq, absolute, and it's transcendent beyond time. This dunya, we don't have much to say about that. Thaniya, right? But Jannah and Nar, they're Jannah is ashraf. Why? Because, right, it's فبقاؤه, right? فبقاؤهما, right? Their baqa is what? Right? هما is, right? Is first is zamani, right? Zamani, muqayyad and mustamid. Right? كلا نمد. Right? And this is mustamid. Right? Mustamid, you can have muftaqir. Right? Muftaqir. Right? وبقاء الجنة والنار شرعي. Right? أي إثبات Baqa'u nar, Jannah and nar, our affirmation of the eternity of heaven and hell is shar'i, established by divine guidance. Right? بالفضل بفضل الله تعالى لا يجب, right? لا عقلي, the intellect does not necessarily affirm this. بل هو جائز عقلا, rather rationally it is simply possible. Right? And then we have the investigation on the today we looked at qidam and baqa. Next lesson we'll be looking at al-mukhalafa lil-hawadith. Allah's being absolutely distinct from originated things. The section on the attributes of Allah requires giving it its due time. So that's what we're going to look at today. بإذن الله تعالى وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. المخالفة للحوادث is also important because there's a lot of people who have confusion about this from our attitudinally divergent brethren. And also many people are confused about this. There's a very respected Syrian scholar now based, I believe, in Egypt, Shaykh Abdul Salam Shannar. I used to visit him outside Damascus. He said, we need to teach people about Aqidah. He was just a couple of years old, maybe 2 years older than me. So go visit him. And one of my friends was studying with him. He's sharp man, sharp young scholar at that time. He says, my sister-in-law once was saying, yeah, Shaykh Abdul Salam, Wallah, Allah is so generous and He's done so much for us. If only we could do something to express how much, كم هو متفضل علينا. He said, I was listening to her, he said, Wallah, if only he put his hand down from the heavens just for a moment so we could, حتى نبوس إيده, so we could kiss his hand. And this is a religious practicing woman. I can't do anything, so maybe I could just kiss his hand. And her question is, it would be appropriate to kiss the hand of God if you're a woman, right? It's like, because the bigger problem, which is, right? So people have these conceptions, right? Some are confused, others affirm that which is not sound to affirm. So this requires a little bit of attention, al-mukhalafa lil-hawadith, right? And then we'll look at qiyamuhu bin-nafs, it's also called al-istighna or al-ghina, and Allah being absolutely independent. And then we come to mabhathul wahdaniyya, the oneness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and we go into the proofs of oneness. We're going to take 2 lessons to cover the section, 2 more lessons to cover the section on the sifat of sifat al-salbiyya, because they need their due time. And then after that we'll get to the affirmative attributes. So we'll give this its due. There's many things coming up that one can proceed much faster on, but this هذا يحتاج إلى إعطاء حقه. Okay, any questions here? Go ahead.
So we mentioned that لا يقارن بزمان. So my question is, so what do we say about the command of Allah? So we know for previous peoples, they some things were permissible for them that may not be permissible for us, or haram for them that may be permissible for us. So when we talk about the sacred laws given to people before, do we say that that the command of Allah is different from what He's telling us through sacred texts? How does that work?
What do you mean?
For example, people before, maybe they had to give more zakat than us, or...
So what's the problem with that?
So do we say that... So how do we articulate it? Do we say that the command of Allah is the same as it always has been, but the sacred laws were different?
The command of Allah, that goes back to understand. So how do we understand the command of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the command is, right? So firstly, what do we affirm about the prophets? We affirm that all the prophets came with the same call. أدعو إلى الله. Right? They all called to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They all came, مبشرين ومنذرين, giving glad tidings of the hereafter and warning. Right? So what they told their people about Allah, because the إخبار لا يتغير, because they are informing of حقائق. The reality of Allah, the reality of death, the reality of the hereafter, the reality of reckoning. These are حقائق. Right? And their role in this is the same, in this sense. Now, who their role relates to, etc., this has to do with the nubuwat, we'll see it. Right? The other prophets had, their risala had takhsis, was limited to whom they were sent. And also mukhassasa zamanan, because they came in their time and their risala remain unaltered for different lengths. Right? That's a separate matter. But the call of all the prophets is one. But the shara'i' they came with differed, which is what you do and what you don't do. Now, what could the shara'i' differ upon? This is a matter of discussion, especially between the Ash'aris and the Maturidis, that would, right? Because no sharia would deem what is qabih aqlan to be allowed. Right? And that's why the Maturidis the Maturidis certainly distinguish between al-hasan fi dhatihi and hasan lima'na fi ghayrihi. Right? So there's the thing that's intrinsically good and something is good due to, that's contingently good. And likewise, the bad is intrinsically good and contingently. The intrinsically bad and contingently bad. But the shara'i' differed. So they came, because the shara'i', mabna shara'i' is at-taslim li amrillah. The command of Allah has, there's al-amir and the ma'mur. The hakim and the mahkum. The one who commands and the one who is commanded. And then you have the hukum, and you have the command. Right? The mahkum bihi, and then the sifatul hukum. And right, so mahkum bihi is, for example, prayer, and its sifa is that it's fard, for example, right? And the related details. Right? So the actual ahkam can differ. Right? So the shara'i' differed in that sense. That comes up in the mabhath of the nubuwat. What's the
amr of Allah being connected to his sifat is without zaman, but the ma'mur bihi comes in.
No, but the amr is not a sifa of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Yeah.
So, but the ma'mur bihi comes within time periods.
Yeah.
If it was like this, then it's.
Yeah.
So if there was like a prophet who came with a shara for people, and like we never met them, they're in some island, and then we come to know them today, and they've been following that shara all the way through. Could we say that a person who's doing something totally different from us can be, doing something praiseworthy to Allah, which may be different from what we're doing, could maybe even possibly be sinful for us? Would that also be praiseworthy to Allah? Because from what I understood, is that the command of Allah is one, everything of Allah is one.
No, that's not. What do you mean? What do you mean by the command of Allah is one? Because there's two things, right? Shaykh Muhammad al-Hashimi in Miftah distinguishes between al-amr al-takwini, which is the existential command, which is kun fayakun, be it and it is. That's one thing. And there's al-amr al-tashri'i, right? Right? It is خطاب الله تعالى المتعلق أو المتعلق بأفعال المكلفين, which is the command which is the hukm al-tashri'i, which is a legislative command, which is Allah's address related to the actions of those morally responsible. So the hakim is Allah. Al-mahkum, who is addressed by that command? So let's say there was an island, right? And nobody found these guys. And they're still acting on the shara of Sayyidina Ibrahim. They missed a whole boatload of prophets, right? And it didn't change. Right? Now, the hakim is Allah. They're mahkum. This was the khitab that related to them. Now, what is ta'ah? What is obedience? That's why definitions are important. We break this down. What is ta'ah? Ta'ah is muwafaqatu fi'l al-abd hukm al-rabb. The correspondence of the actions of the servant, al-mahkum, who is commanded, the command of their Lord, الذي هو الحاكم. Right? That's ta'ah. So if this was the khitab to them and they acted accordingly, al-marju min fadlillah is that they have reward for it. بشروطه al-ikhlas, etc. Now, when did naskh happen to the shara? It depends on which prophet were. This is taqdeeri, but when the Prophet ﷺ came, all shara'i' were mansukha. So now after that, people enter Jannah by if the message of the Prophet reached them, they must follow his shara. Right? If the message did not reach them, then they are under the amnesty of Allah. And each person will be judged according to, they're under the amnesty of Allah, and then how are particular people dealt with? That's mufawwad lil-Rabb. What is the scope of وَمَنْ يَعْمَلْ مِثْقَالَ ذَرَّةٍ خَيْرًا يَرَى وَمَنْ يَعْمَلْ مِثْقَالَ ذَرَّةٍ شَرًّا يَرَى? That is under the scope of, that goes back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala.
But so if time doesn't relate to Allah, then why does the shara change, which is from Allah?
Why do things change? Why did this carpet not exist during the time of Sayyidina Adam?
But isn't the shara a command from Allah?
Okay, yeah. So, but what is the problem with that? Why can, like even let's say if the entrepreneur sister runs a company, she commands she commands some of the sisters to do A. She commands someone else to do B. What's the problem?
Well, for Allah, time doesn't relate to him, so how does it change?
No, the change applies to creation, not to him. Did he wait? Okay, Sayyidina Adam do this. Then he waits and someone else do this? No. From eternity, this is how, the khitab goes back to the divine speech. It related to all these things. Different people are commanded different things. ايش فيها? Right? I mean, there are underlying issues, and this is why they distinguish between the ikhbar. What's the difference between the khabar and the amr, for example? That which relates to informing, that has to do with reality, and reality does not change. Right? So heaven either exists or it doesn't. Unless heaven was only for some people and not for others. Right? In itself, the world either ends or it doesn't, assuming that there's one world. right? But if Allah created multiple worlds, in one world people go to heaven or hell, the other they just come to existence and they disappear. Right? Allah inspired the animals with things, but did He make them morally responsible? No. Do animals die? Are animals resurrected? Yes. Is there judgment for animals? Yes. But just ala wajh al-qisas, just to manifest the addressing and redressing of rights. But do they have reward and punishment beyond that? In terms of, is there heaven and hell for animals? No. So the khitab differs for animals. It's not called shara anyways. But how it relates to the animals, but Allah inspired animals with their natures. Not all cats are created equal. That Allah tells us about, He addressed them, but khitab yaliqu bihim. That's okay. Okay. So, Bismillah. So we're going to look at إيضاح المبهم بإذن الله. Omar, where? بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. In our lessons on إيضاح المبهم, شرح السلم, we reached lines 12, reached line number 12. We'll be looking at lines number 12 to 14. So he says, سميته بالسلم المنورق يرقى به سماء وعلم المنطق. Right? I have called it السلم المنورق. Right? The radiant, beautified ladder by which one ascends the sky of the science of logic. Wallaha arju an yakuna khalisa. It is Allah I hope that it be sincere. Liwajhihi al-kareem, for His noble entity, for His noble countenance. Laysa qalisa, and not deficient. وأن يكون نافعا للمبتدئ, and that it be beneficial to the beginner, به إلى المطولات يهتدي, by it to the large texts they be guided. So there's a couple of things here, right? And of course he again uses examples of balagha, of eloquence, that by which one rises to the sky of the science of mantiq. This is of course a reminder that human beings are not merely rational, but they also have emotions. They have emotions, they have imaginations, right? And part of effective khitab, effective address, is sound in accordance with language. It is well structured in accordance with reason. So that's grammar, logic. But it conveys these sound meanings effectively. And the effective conveying of meanings, this is balagha. This is very, very important. And of course, anybody in any language needs to invest in being able to communicate effectively in that language. And everything has usul. Now people don't apply that to the rest of their life. Say, okay, I'm studying Nahu and Sarf and Balagha in Arabic. But I'm not going to do that in German, and they're German. That why did you study Nahu, Sarf and Balagha? It's not an Amr Ta'abbudi. If you just wanted to do something devotional, sit, read a lot of Quran. But because this is Talab al-Ilm. But, the need for rhetoric, and effective grammar and logic, the logic is the same in its building blocks, but to know how to structure arguments, addressing the modern mind, one needs to see how the modern mind works. Because reason itself is the same, but how minds reason now, what works with them and what doesn't, one needs to have consciousness of that. One needs to also have consciousness of effective إِلَّا بِلِسَانِ قَوْمِهِ. All prophets were sent speaking the language of their people, right? That's an ishara here, right? It is Allah, I hope that it be sincere. So the commentator says, أقول قال الشارح وهو الإمام الدمنهوري رحمه الله أقول الضمير المتصل بسميته يعود على المؤلف المفهوم من السياق. I named it السلم المنورق. This ضمير سميته goes back to the mu'allaf, the book that is authored, that is understood from the context. That's understood by the context. Right? Why? Because the dhamir needs to go back to something. Right? I named it. What does it go back to? To that which is understood from the context. Right? Samma, and the word samma, naming, يتعدى لمفعولين. It takes two مفعوls, two objects. للأول بنفسه, the first by itself, وللثاني بنفسه أو بالباء. And the second مفعول, the second object, it can take itself. سمى زيد ولده إبراهيم. And Zayd named his son Ibrahim. You could, the two maf'uls. Zayd named A, B. سمى زيد ولده إبراهيم. Or you can سمى زيد ولده بإبراهيم. Zayd named his son with Ibrahim. Right? كما هنا. That's the example here. والسلم, literally, السلم is a ladder. ما له درج يتوصل به من سفل إلى علو. A ladder is that which has steps by which one goes from the low to the high. واستعماله في المعاني مجاز. And its usage in meanings is metaphorical. Is metaphorical. Right? And the reason it's called this is because you go from يتوصل به إلى أصعب منه من الكتب. This is a means to get to the more complex works. That's one potential interpretation. This is mentioned by Quwaisani in his commentary. But the other meaning, that one rises in the skies of logic, because initially one could only, how can you define things? If we did a test right now, what is your ability to define things? You could define simple things, but you might not be able to define. So there's simple things, there's things of intermediate complexity, and there's complex things to define. You could maybe do simple definitions, but not complex ones. Can you structure an argument? You might be able to do simple ones, but not slightly more complex ones. What kind of argument is this? I say, but you can't identify an argument where some parts are missing. You don't know a complex argument. Right? So either you're able to go from only a basic capacity to reason in terms of definitions and arguments, and identifying others' definitions and arguments in terms of soundness and unsoundness, to rise up in it, in ability, but also just as a science. Right? Okay. والمنورق بتقديم النون منورق المزين. منورق means مزين, that which is adorned. Right? Right? منورق right? And there's some discussion about that, you can see. It's munawraq, because the awam would say munarwaq, but that's not what's mentioned here. Yurqa ay yus'ad, rising meaning ascending. Ilm al-mantiq, the science of logic. Now ilm, what's al-muradu bihi al-masail, what's meant by the science of logic, meaning the issues of the science. شبه تلك المسائل بالسماء بجامع البعد. Right? And he compared the issues of the science of logic with the sky, with the shared meaning of distance. Right? والشرف and nobility. Right? Right? Yani, because their ulu, the sky, is high tangibly. Right? Right? It's high and it's distant. These meanings are distant from understandings unless they have the ladder of قواعد. العلم بقواعد, يعني, this knowledge of principles. يحفظ مراعاتها الذهن, that if upheld they protect the mind from errors in reasoning. But also يحفظ يعني يعين مراعاتها الذهن على الترقي في درجات الفهم الدقيق. Right? These are principles which, if upheld, assist the mind to rise in the degrees of subtle thinking and reason. Right? Then he says, rahimahullah, ثم طلب من الحق من المولى سبحانه أن يكون تأليف هذا الكتاب خالصا من الرياء. Then the author asked the master, glorious is he, that this book, that the authoring of this book be sincere from riya, from showing off. Right? Now, الخلوص هو الصفاء. يعني وهو خلوء الشيء عن كدر النقائص. Right? That which is pure, خالص, is الصافي, is that which is خلوص is الصفاء. يعني is purity, يعني from كدر النقائص, from the dross, the admixture of imperfections. Right? What is the greatest imperfection? It is riya. ما قصد به غير الله تعالى. Right? Riya is that which other than Allah is sought by. So فقال والله أرجو. Right? It is Allah I hope from. Right? إلى آخره أي أؤمل. Right? That I place my aspiration in. Right? And this, تقديم المعمول يفيد الاختصاص. Right? Putting the divine name first, putting the object of the sentence first, يفيد الاختصاص. أي لا غيره. Right? Right? والوجه الذات. Right? يعني, and this is affirmed in the Quran, this is from the usage of the Arabs. Right? In the Arab, generally in language, you can mention part of something and refer to the whole. Right? But wajhullah is dhatuhu, because Allah does not have a part. Right? But who wajhullah, because he is al-mutawajjah ilayhi, he's the one people turn to. Right? So that's why one of the and so that's why the ulama explained wajh. ويبقى وجه ربك أي يبقى ذات ربك أي أو وجود ربك, which is the two relate, because that هو واجب الوجود. Right? In the Quran, the use of wajh, you interpret the ulama of Ahl-Sunnah as being Allah Himself or His existence, and the two are interrelated. Right? Because Allah is the necessary existent. الوجه الذات القالس الناقص, meaning deficient. ثم طلب منه سبحانه وتعالى أن يكون خالصا والله أرجو. Right? Right? I hope. Right? والرجاء يعني is to seek a desired outcome and to take the means of attaining it. But raja points to the reality of إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين. That raja is only from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because the servant's hope is seeking praiseworthy outcomes while taking the means of attaining them. But the hope, this is kayfiyatul raja. But al-marjuwu minhu Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? Because raja has, for soundness of raja, you need to understand what is raja. وَالرَّاجِي هُوَ الْعَبْدِ الْمَرْجُوُ مِنْهُ is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And there's a kayfiyatul raja, which is بالأخذ بالأسباب مع الاعتماد على الله لا على الأسباب. Right? Raja has four integrals. So know what is hope, which is seeking a desired outcome and taking the means of attaining it. The one who's hoping is the servant. Why? Because they are weak and needy and dependent upon Allah. The one hoped from is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because He is Al-Ghani, Al-Rahim, Al-Kareem, ila nihayati awsa. He is Al-Rabb. And there's a kayfiyya, there's a means of expressing the hope, which is بأخذ الأسباب مع الاعتماد على الله دون الاعتماد على الأسباب ولا على الشخص. يعني is the element, how one hopes is by taking the means, بالأخذ بالأسباب المؤدية, taking the effective means with trust in Allah, without trusting in the means or in oneself or in any besides Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And those are the elements of raja. As mentioned by the ulama, رضي الله عنه. ثم طلب, then he asked, منه سبحانه أن ينفع به المبتدئ. Then he asked that Allah Most High benefit the beginner. وأن يتوصل به إلى الكتب المطولات, and that this be a means to reach the larger works in the subject. فقال وأن يكون إلى آخره. So he said, and that this be, etc. Right? للمبتدئ المبتدئ. Right? Now, what is the difference between a beginner and someone who has understanding? Right? So this is a really useful thing that you can actually use elsewhere as well. So he says, المبتدئ من ليس له قدرة على تصوير مسائل الفن الذي يقرأ فيه. The beginner is one who does not conceive of the issues of the subject that they're reading in. The beginner, you have no exposure to it. So you don't even know what the issues are. Right? Right? فإن قدر على ذلك فالمتوسط. An intermediate student knows what the issues of the subject are. They have حسن تصور of the issues of the subject. وإن قدر على إقامة دليلها فمنتهٍ. And the advanced student is the one who can who knows the issues and can establish their proofs and arguments and so on. And of course, there's some detail to this. Some define it that there's a complete beginner who does not know the issues of the subject. The second person, and there is a beginner who has studied. So some divide a beginner into two levels. The beginner who studied, who understands the issues, لكن لا يستطيع أن يعبر عنها بلغة أهل هذا العلم. The intermediate student then knows the issues with their details and can express them in accordance with the usage of the scholars. Right? And there's levels of intermediate student, and the advanced student know related issues, and that's discussed elsewhere. مراتب طلبة العلم or مراتب طلبة العلم. There's many discussions on that. Now, the origin of the Sullam al-Munawwaraq of al-Akhdari, he based this upon Isa Ghuji. Isa Ghuji, right? 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 And many people wrote commentaries on this work, right? Amongst them, the most famous of these, in terms of what's most taught, is Ad-Damanhuri Sharh that we're studying, Idah al-Mubham, on the Sullam of Al-Akhdari. But the author himself, the author of As-Sullam, the poem, wrote a commentary on it, Al-Akhdari. Right? And there's a number of others who wrote commentaries upon them, and there's some recently, I think half a dozen commentaries on the Sullam have been published together. Shuruh al-Sullam al-Munawwaraq, they're published together. Amongst them, Al-Qaddura, al-Tunisi, Al-Mallawi, who's has two commentaries on the Sullam, a large one and a small one, and his student As-Sabban, and Sabban was brilliant. As-Sabban wrote some great hawashi in different subjects. As-Sabban wrote a hashia, and that's really one of the great works of grammar. Hashiyat As-Sabban ala al-Ushmuni, on the Alfiyat ibn Malik. And As-Sabban, Hashiyat As-Sabban on Mallawi's shorter commentary is also published, and others. Right? And there's a number of these, and one of the commentaries that the ulama often refer to is Al-Quwaisni. There's many commentaries, but just mentioning a few. Al-Quwaisni. And then one of the later commentaries is by Al-Imam Shaykh al-Islam Ibrahim ibn Muhammad al-Bajuri, who Shaykh Adib would frequently refer to as Khatimat al-Muhaqqiqeen. His hashia is brilliant, and there's others. The Shinqitis have a turra, they have marginal notes on the poem, etc. Right? And if you have the Indonesian hashia, you can see the details of the various works on it. But and that Indonesian hashia is quite useful for clarificatory purposes, etc. Then he says, وَقَدْ أَجَابَ الْمَوْلَى سُبْحَانَهُ وَتَعَالَى. Allah Most High answered al-mu'allif, the author, بعين ما طلب, with exactly what he asked for. And this is mentioned by a great Imam of Islam, right? And they say, يعني التسليم للفقهاء السلام في الدين. You know, deferring to the learned is safety in religion. فكل من قرأ كتابه هذا بنية واعتناء يفتح الله سبحانه عليه في هذا العلم. So everyone who reads this book, meaning studies it, with intention, أي بنية أي صالحة صادقة, واعتناء and concern, because you got to do your part. Allah opens for them in this science, mantiq. And through that, this is mi'yarul ulum. This is a criteria for soundly being able to navigate the other sciences. وَقَدْ شَاهَدْنَا ذَلِكَ. Imam al-Damanhuri rahimahullah says, and we have witnessed this. وَقَدْ أَخْبَرَنَا شَيْخُنَا عَنْ أَشْيَاخِهِ. And our teacher has related from his teachers. Right? Right? أن المؤلف رحمه الله كان من أكابر الصوفية. That the author Al-Akhdari was one of the great Sufis. He's of course a great Imam of the Islamic sciences. Al-Akhdari has great works in Maliki fiqh, Mukhtasar Al-Akhdari and other works. He has great works in language and balagha and also here. وكان رحمه الله مجاب الدعوة. And he was someone whose dua was answered. Right? Rahimahullah ta'ala. May Allah have mercy on him. وَنَفَعَنَا بِبَرَكَاتِهِمْ. And he benefit us through his blessings. وَأَعَادَ عَلَيْنَا مِنْ صَالِحِ دَعَوَاتِهِ. And he grant us increase from the author's sincere intentions. Because he prayed أن يكون نافعا للمبتدئ, that it be of benefit to the beginner. And you say, okay, some beginner out there. No, I am the beginner. And I need to benefit from this. Right? So this is the dua. Right? So the dua was not just for people in his age. Right? And others said the same thing, that this was mushahad. Right? And the Shaykh, of course, of the author was, the Shaykh of Damanhuri was Al-Yusi. And Al-Yusi has a sharh on the Kubra of Imam al-Sanusi. And other works. Right? 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 They mention many great qualities about this, right? Then he said, and we'll look at these lines, and then we'll just mention the lines, and we'll look at them next week bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. So he says, والخلف في جواز الاشتغال به على ثلاثة أقوال فابن الصلاح والنووي حرم وقال قوم ينبغي أن يعلم والقولة المشهورة الصحيحة جوازه لكامل القريحة ممارس السنة والكتاب ليهتدي به إلى الصواب. So he says rahimahullah, the difference regarding the permissibility of study of the science of logic is divided into three opinions. So Ibn Salah and Nawawi prohibited it. And we'll see that this is not a khilaf haqiqi. Because what they prohibited was the logic that is admixed with the philosophical ideas of the non-Islamic philosophers. Right? This is just a straight up translation of the works of the Greeks, for example, and the mantiq of some of the sects of Islam, of the falasifatul Arab, the Arab philosophers, and some of the Islamic philosophers who were influenced by philosophical ideas at variance with Ahl Sunnah. Right? Why? Because it's benefit mixed with harm, and harm is avoided. وَقَالَ قَوْمٌ يَنْبَغِي أَنْ يُعْلَمَ. And others said that it must be learned. And it's attributed, for example, to Imam al-Ghazali. It must be learned. Right? Why? Because, and we'll see the beautiful quote of Imam al-Ghazali about that, right? But then he says, وَالْقَوْلَةُ الْمَشْهُورَةُ الصَّحِيحَةُ. The sound and well-known opinion. And this is مَسْتَقَرَّهَ عَلَيْهِ الْعُلَمَاء, that the scholars were firm upon. جَوَازُهُ, its permissibility. But for whom? Not absolutely. It's not absolutely permissible. And it's not absolutely impermissible. لِكَامِلِ الْقَرِيحَةِ, for someone of sound temperament. Right? Of sound temperament. And qariha can be aql, but it's also temperament. Right? Why? Because let's say that there's some young sister. She says, I want to refute my father because he says strange things, and I want to refute so on. And they come to you and say, I want to study mantiq. Okay? Because I want to debate so and so and refute so and do all this. Do you know, هل تعلمت القرآن? Have you studied the Quran? I said, no. Do you know anything about the Prophet ﷺ? No. Do you know the basics of your deen? No. Right? So this is ممارس السنة والكتاب, who has familiarity with the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. ممارسة عملية وعلمية, that they act upon the sunnah. Right? So they are a person of religious concern. Right? So one is amalan, right? That someone is of sound practice. They have sound temperament, sound practice. And also, the first thing you learn, and they've learned their basics. You don't study logic before you study mabadi' ad-din. Right? Mabadi' ad-din. No, first learn what you believe, the basics of what you believe about Allah. Learn the ibadat, etc. Ma yajibu alayk. Now, to deepen your understanding, so you've taken care of bidayatul hidayah, the beginning of guidance, i'tiqadan, right? Imanan wa islaman wa ihsanan, with amal, liyahtadi bihi ila as-sawabi, so that you're guided through this to what is sound. And so it's not a tool, so you don't use it as a tool to harm others. And one of the things that the mashayikh would warn about is it's very important for the talib al-ilm to have balance in their two things. Tartib in their seeking of knowledge, orderedness in their seeking of knowledge. Right? Tartib, and number two, tawazun. Not to do too much of one thing and not enough of another. So frequently, for example, especially in general, but two of the great educating scholars that I met, Shaykh Adib Kallas, for example, someone finished a couple of books in one science, although Shaykh Adib would approach the student of knowledge that أنا خادمك. If you were to go and say, I want to study an advanced book, he says, تحت على يعني أمرك. He would go bring the book, he wouldn't ask, who are you, what have you studied? He says, أنا مثل البواب. I'm just the gatekeeper. The student of knowledge comes to seek knowledge, I just open the door for them. Al-madar alayhi. The whole matter revolves around him. That would be his attitude. Even we'd visit him for Eid, he'd insist on serving the tea and the coffee himself. أنا خدام طلبة العلم. I'm just a complete servant for students of knowledge. That's why people would warn, when you go to Shaykh Adib, consult somebody else, because he's not going to, it's very hard to get him. He said, no. He said, تحت أمرك. He'd be genuinely, I'll do what you want me to do. But people would advise, consult somebody before you go. Or know how to consult him. Anyways, so one of the errors is doing things in the wrong order. doing an advanced text before an early text. That's one. But the other thing is doing too much of one subject and not the other. Because there is a tertib for the science, like Sajid Rizad is tertibul ulum. So they say if you do man istajal al-shay' qabla awanihi, you hasten one matter before its time, you will fall into harm. Why? You study too much aqeedah, suddenly you feel like you're everybody else's judge, but you don't know many of the ahkam. You don't know how to pray in a nuanced manner. You don't know anything about the state of your heart. You haven't given attention to fiqh. You haven't given attention to tasawwuf. You haven't given attention to hadith. Say, I follow the Prophet. What do you know about seerah? What do you know about shama'il? What about the Book of Allah? Where are you in terms of reciting the Book of Allah? Where are you with respect to understanding the Book of Allah? There's other sciences you need. So even then later, if you don't know Quran or Hadith or Fiqh, then you get to more advanced books of even one subject, Aqidah, you don't know what they're saying. Because the sciences each feed upon the other. Grammar, you don't even understand what is actually being said in the text because you're not understanding it soundly. Same, Shaykh Akram Abdul Wahab al-Mawsili, people, and he's a Mubarak Shaykh, subhanAllah. In a brief period of time, he taught so many texts. In his first 3 months in Amman, he taught Sharh al-Waraqat 14 times to different people, while interviewing for different university teaching jobs. And while seemingly just chilling out. Somebody actually asked, does Shaykh Akram actually do anything in Amman? They always seem so relaxed, so calm. Even young students, he'd be like, تعال اشرب شاي عندنا. تفضل. And he had to tell people, if you go to Shaykh Akram, he's like your grandfather. Like, make the tea. Right? I had to take his oath with him. Say, please do not make the tea. And don't spoil these Westerners. أصلاً ما عندهم أدب. They don't have adab. But there's a problem because the Iraqis, especially the Mosulis, make this chai, they call it chai al-hibr, ink tea. So tea is supposed to be so dark, they say if you put it against the sun at dhuhr time, you can't see the sun through it. It's supposed to be really strong. It's not like the shami or tea. It's okay, teach us, and we'll teach these guys. Anyways, someone comes, okay, I've studied Sharh al-Waraqat. I'd like to do the next text. Shaykh Akram wouldn't agree. He'd actually go and ask him, إيش قرأت في العقيدة؟ إيش قرأت في الفقه? What have you studied in Aqidah? What have you studied in fiqh? What have you studied in grammar? So that one, go stage by stage. One of the dangers of logic is if someone has a sharp mind, it's very easy for them to become arrogant. And that's خطورة العلوم العقلية. Right? Because العقل مصدر شرف الإنسان. It's the honor of the human being. لقد كرمنا بني آدم. We have honored the children of Adam. Why? Because granted them القدرة على التمييز. Okay? Granted the capacity to distinguish. Which is the aql. These are the principles of reasoning. But that aql, if it's not rooted in ubudiyya, becomes mufsid, la muslih. Is given susceptible to corrupting rather than benefiting. That's the danger. أنا خير منه. If you understand logic, and all of us, I know sound arguments and I know this and I know this, that's shaitan. أنا خير منه. That's the danger of the ulum al-aqliyah. Right? So even people specialize in it, like Shaykh Adib, someone did Idah al-Mu'min, said just do it again. So that's one of the things to be careful about. Right? So in proceeding in this is sort of like our covenant that we take care of our religious knowledge and we take care of our religious practice. Mumaris is sunnah, the mumarasa, there's a mumarasa amaliya. that every believer to be in soundness in their life, in their ilm, and in their attitude, you have to have a living relationship with the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, amalan, that you're committed to acting on the sunnah of the Nabi ﷺ, and the kitab, tilawatan wa tadabburan. And then ilman, which is to be connected with the ulum al-shar'iyyah. These are thimar al-Quran wa sunnah. Right? And then as one rises, so the first thimar of the Quran and Sunnah are their ahkam, the basic rulings, then the understanding, but then one also needs to cultivate one's understanding of the tafsir of the Quran, sharh of the hadith, etc. Because if one doesn't do that and just focuses on reason, then one goes far away from ma ja'a bihi Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Right? So the detail of this, so he says أقول ذكر في هذا الفصل حكم الاشتغال بعلم المنطق لكونه من المبادئ العشرة التي ينبغي لكل شارع في علم أن يقف عليها. He mentions in this section the ruling of busying oneself with the science of logic, that because this is the ruling of the science is one of the 10 foundational investigations that anyone who begins any subject should be aware of. That what's its ruling? So that ليكون على بصيرة, so they have clarity and insight فيما يشرع فيه, in what they're directing themselves towards. Like basira, right, is certain clear knowledge. على بصيرة, like in Surah Yusuf, قل هذه سبيلي أدعو إلى الله على بصيرة. Right? In the Indonesian Hashim, he quotes As-Sabban. He says, Al-Basira quwwatu idrak al-nafs. Basira, insight, is a depth of discernment of the self. Right? But here what's meant, ala basira, so they have clarity about the ruling of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? So he says, the Mabadi' al-Ashara, they're pointed to here in the Indonesian Hashia. He has several pages unpacking the Mabadi' al-Ashara. Right? And that's a useful discussion if someone wants to read it. It says, وَقَدْ اسْتَوْفَى مَبَادِئَ هَذَا الْفَنِّ شيخ مشايخنا سيدي سعيد قدورة في شرحه لهذا الكتاب. So he points towards the Shaykh of his Shaykhs, Shaykh Qaddura, that he mentioned these 10 mabadi in full, right, in his book. These 10, right? So he's referring to his Shaykh's work. So this is where we're going to continue. What are the 10, right, underlying investigations related to this science? What's the name of this science? What are the issues it deals? What's its relationship to the other sciences, etc. Right? So we'll stop here, right? In the midst of these lines on, and the summary is the science is al-qawlatu as-sahihatu al-mashhura. The sound opinion is that logic is permissible and praiseworthy. Permissible and praiseworthy for the individual. It's a collective obligation for the ummah. Because it is required to be able to present the religion in a sophisticated manner, because some people need a deep understanding to remove the confusions of the confused and to refute the arguments of those who are spreading misguidance. Right? So it's a fard kifaya. And it is highly recommended for students of knowledge, particularly where they're not in an environment where everybody is accepting of religious guidance, so that they're able to convey things with the sophistication needed to convey clearly. البلاغ المبين. So we'll look at that, and there's some beautiful quotes there from Imam al-Ghazali, etc., giving us background on the importance of this science. وصلى الله على سيدنا ونبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم والحمد لله رب العالمين. Any questions here? بسم الله. الحمد لله رب العالمين.